3 years ago, an 845-page congressional report concluded Donald Trump spread fake claims of electoral fraud in the 2020 US presidential election. These false claims, the report said, provoked his supporters to violence in the January 6th Capitol riot. In a nutshell, the committee accused the outgoing president of an attempted coup to remain in power. A BBC Panorama documentary traced the story.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
An edited clip, but an altered story. Today, the US president, serving his second term, is suing the BBC for $1 billion over their narrative of events that day. How on earth did we get here? Last Thursday, the Telegraph released an exposé of the BBC.
The Telegraph has seen a letter that reveals one of the BBC's own independent advisers repeatedly warned that the broadcaster had serious and systemic problems.
It centred on a dossier by an ex-BBC advisor saying the BBC had doctored Donald Trump's speech to make it wrongly appear he called for violence on that day. The dossier, written by a man called Michael Prescott, who we'll hear more about, also said BBC Arabic had given too much space to Hamas views in its coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. For days, the BBC was silent, and then on Sunday, they apologised and announced two shocking resignations. Head of News, Deborah Turnus, and Director General Tim Davie. Now, Turnus said that the buck stops with her, but the attacks on the BBC did not stop with her resignation. The US president then threatened the BBC with a crippling lawsuit. His lawyers told the BBC they have until the 14th of November to retract the documentary and compensate Donald Trump, or else he will claim $1 billion in damages. BBC insiders have called what led to the resignations a coup inside one of the most trusted news outlets in the world. At the heart of it is a war of narratives, not just between the right and the left, but between those aligned with Israel and those critical of Israel's actions in Gaza. Today, we'll investigate the BBC's internal politics and what they tell us about the politics of the world. Now, Trump may be the face of the unravelling debate, but the story here is much more complex. The report at the heart of the scandal, supposedly from an independent advisor, also accuses the BBC of being pro-Hamas in its coverage of Gaza. I'm sure many Middle East Eye viewers would disagree with this, having felt the disjuncture between the live streaming of Israeli crimes online and their coverage, or lack thereof, in mainstream Western news media. And look, just before the Telegraph's exposé, over 100 BBC staff members accused their employer of giving Israel favourable coverage and systematically dehumanising Palestinians. In fact, here's MEE's own columnist, Peter Oborne, berating the BBC's director of news on the topic.
170-something journalists murdered by Israel. BBC's only bothered to report 6% of them, whereas you dutifully reported 60% of Ukrainian journalists. Do you agree with David Lammy that there are no journalists in Gaza? You were saying you had your own people. Why? I would love to know why you've only reported.
Peter Oborne joins me now. Peter, which is it? Is the BBC biased for Israel, against it, or neither?
The idea that the BBC is pro-Palestinian, which is fondly held, by the way, by supporters of Israel, and they frequently call the BBC pro-Hamas and so on, is simply for the birds. It's a defiance of the proven facts.
So then what's really going on? Because if you see the headlines, right, you see the BBC has been accused of pro-Hamas bias, and then you see that the BBC apologises and the BBC issues resignations. You think, OK, well, the BBC is admitting to bias. But at Middle East Eye, I mean, our coverage clearly shows that that is not the case. And so there's something clearly happening inside the BBC that explains this.
Yeah.
If we look at the heart of this scandal, right, there's a dossier by someone who used to be an independent advisor to the BBC, a man called Michael Prescott. What light can you shed on what is happening?
Now, the government under which Michael Prescott would have been appointed would have been the late Tory government. That Tory government was very hostile to the BBC. Then if you read this report of his, it's not an independent report at all. It's I've studied the remarks he makes about BBC English's coverage, and he only makes negative points about the BBC coverage from an Israeli perspective. He doesn't mention any of the things which I was itemizing, the many omissions, failures of reporting, the gross bias in reporting towards Palestinians.
So if this report was not impartial at all, why is that the case? And why did it get so much prominence in basically causing a crisis in the BBC?
Why is always a difficult question. And so let's just go through. The Telegraph got this leak. We don't know who leaked it. That's a very interesting and important question. It was then followed up by the Daily Mail, and in particular the late, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, here Boris Johnson suddenly gained an interest in high standards in public life and in journalism. That's after 30 years of having the lowest possible standards. Mr. Johnson is a proven liar. He was sacked from his first job in journalism. And then he was, of course, pumped up by the Daily Mail, which has waged a long, we can say this is a fact, as a hostility to the BBC. The Telegraph's got a long hostility to the BBC. The Murdoch press, Murdoch has long wanted that sort of territory at the heart of our public life. So something is going on here. We don't know. All we can do is state facts about who's been making these allegations. And then, of course, Donald Trump is the biggest liar in modern history. So the idea he cares about facts and accuracy is also ludicrous.
Well, at least one party celebrating the resignations of the BBC is Israel. The Israeli embassy posted welcoming what is happening. If we want to understand the forces in play and we need to focus on the facts and what we do know, what do we know about Israeli influence inside the BBC? And do you think that that could have anything to do with what is unravelled here?
Look, I like to deal with the things I can state as a matter of uncontested fact. And what we do know about Israeli influence is that they are listened to, they're Israeli, and so they should be, by the BBC, because the BBC kind of high-ups have said, we listen to them, and we take a great interest in what they say, and we try to make sure we listen to their complaints. There's a fascinating account of the nature of those Israeli complaints given by Ben de Per after that remarkable Medics film was trashed by was cancelled by the BBC. Well worth reading it. It's in the Observer, and you can see the sort of complaints that they were getting and were internalised by the BBC. The BBC editorial team was said to Mr. de Per, the producer of the film, can we trust Amnesty and the UN? Well, that's a statement coming from Israel. It's not a statement coming from the BBC, but the BBC seem to have taken that distrust of Amnesty and the UN, two of the most respected institutions in the world, with great seriousness. Now, I think that they listened too hard to the BBC, but to the Israelis, because really Channel 4 went on and screened that film. So the BBC is frightened. It's frightened of its shadow. It's exceptionally badly led, and so forth.
At the heart of this BBC crisis are a number of contested narratives. What happened with the January 6th riots and the US presidential election in 2020? What happened with Israel's war on Gaza? But really, at the core of this is a battle between the left and the right. Joining me next is national broadcaster and former BBC journalist Sangita Myska. Sangita, we're essentially being told here that the BBC has a systematic left-wing bias. Is this your experience?
Yeah, look, the debate that's raging right now is as exactly as you say. The allegations from the right-wing press and critics of the BBC is that it is systemically biased towards the left, and that manifests itself in terms of its coverage to be anti-Trump and anti-Israel. Let's just try and break that down a bit. The BBC, of course, is the biggest news broadcaster in the UK, possibly in the world, and you would think that if it was systemically biased, what you would be able to see is some kind of tangible societal or political result, right? So let's take a look back to see whether or not that actually exists. Well, if you were to go back to the Brexit referendum that was largely pushed on by right-wing political influencers and right-wing political parties, the UK Brexited. If you were to look at the 2019 general election, Labour got its most left-wing Labour leader in Jeremy Corbyn. And just before that election, the BBC Panorama strand, the same one that's under scrutiny now and accused of being left-wing, that same documentary strand produced a documentary that did Jeremy Corbyn's reputation incredible amounts of harm. And to put it bluntly, he's never really been able to recover from that. And what resulted was the Labour Party's worst election result since 1935. Even if you were to jump forward to the 2024 general election, yes, the Labour Party won that election after 14 years of what many people consider catastrophic Conservative rule. But it won that election actually with a very small vote share. In fact, one that was lower than what Jeremy Corbyn received. So as far as looking at tangible outcomes, there aren't tangible outcomes that you can point to that would give you the impression, or certainly uphold the idea, that BBC News is systemically biased.
Well, look, the right wing has leapt on this story. Among them, the head of the rapidly rising far-right Reform Party here in the UK, Nigel Farage.
The BBC has been institutionally biased for decades. I well remember the Wilson report 2 decades ago, saying the BBC were not covering areas like Europe and immigration with any sense of impartiality. And you could, add on to that net zero, climate change, all their interpretation of the horrors that have happened in Gaza, and now, of course, the United States president.
So if this is a false narrative, it is being used to serve an agenda. Therefore, should the BBC not have done more to defend its journalism and to defend its journalists who are essentially being dragged through the mud?
In my opinion, yes, it should have done a lot more, and it can still do a lot more. I know some of the journalists that have been mentioned in that leaked report, and on a personal level, they found the coverage over the last week absolutely devastating. But at a corporate level, what the BBC needs to do is really pull up its socks and say, we stand by our journalism. Undoubtedly, mistakes have been made, but there is absolutely no evidence that there is systemic bias. The more often the BBC capitulates to political power, the more often it's going to be under political attack. And as a result, it's ended up in this very strange cycle, which means that every single time a right-wing political party or right-wing commentators make complaints to the BBC on one level absolutely should look at those complaints, but it should also look at the veracity of those complaints, the quality of those complaints, and decide whether or not they actually hold any water. Instead, what we seem to be seeing is, as social media and politics in the UK lurches to the right, the BBC has become almost hypersensitive to that and tends to overcorrect. And that is the key problem. By not defending its journalists, either on a corporate level or individually, what that's doing is having a chilling effect across the organisation. It would have the same chilling effect even if it wasn't the BBC and it was another news organisation. What journalists need to know as they carry out their work in increasingly contentious times is that When they get it right, they will be properly defended. And when they get it wrong, there will be a fair and impartial investigation. And where corrections can be made, they will be made. But individuals won't necessarily be thrown under the bus. And that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Why are we seeing that? Like, why has the BBC capitulated to this lefty representation of them?
So I think a lot of this goes back to the governance structures. The BBC is funded in a unique way. It's supposed to be answerable to the public. And the reason it's supposed to be answerable to the public and not to politicians is because it is we, the licence fee payers, that fund it. So if you own a television in the UK, you have to buy a TV licence. That money is £180 a year, which is actually incredibly good value, given all of the services you get from the BBC. And that money goes to the BBC and it funds it. It is a flat tax. So everyone gets whacked. The problem here is that the way the BBC is set up, every 10 years it has to go to the government of the day with a begging bowl, and it has to say to the government, we really, really need more money. Can you ensure that the licence fee increases? Now, it's had variable degrees of success. The last negotiation was not judged to be successful. It was essentially frozen for 2 years, then it went up by an incremental amount in line with inflation. But what you've now got is a situation where the people that run the BBC have to essentially keep the government of the day on side in order that it isn't unduly penalised. That's one problem. The other problem you've got is that the way the BBC governance structure is set up, the board has a number of part-time non-executive directors that are political appointments, and those political appointments are made, again, by the government of the day. And a lot of the controversy that you're seeing now is around whether Boris Johnson, who of course was a Tory and notoriously criticised the BBC, made a series of appointments that have now led to today's crisis. And I think actually there's quite a lot of evidence that that's the case.
So actually what we're seeing here is that, you know, political influence over the press, it's rearing its head, but it is already there. The roots for that have already been laid. Sangita Myska, thank you so much for shedding light on what is happening here. For today, that is all that we have time for here at MEE Live. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social media or email meelive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be here at 5 p.m. UK time, noon in New York, every Tuesday and Thursday. See you then.